They told her a black woman had no business outside the jazz clubs and cabarets. In their eyes, she was a nobody beyond the stage, a living caricature meant to shimmy and smile, not to be heard. When she danced, they cheered or laughed, but never out of respect. In the smoke-filled music halls of 1920s Paris, aristocrats and officers clinked glasses and watched her sway in feathers and beads, smirking at the primitive spectacle. Across the ocean in America, newspapers dismissed her as a scandalous Negro novelty, not a real artist. Time magazine even sneered that this Negro wench was nothing special, that her dancing and singing might be topped anywhere outside of Paris. They applauded her body, her outrageous costume, her pet cheetah on a leash prowling the stage, but they denied her dignity. To the so-called civilized world, Josephine Baker was an exotic curiosity, fascinating, perhaps, but inferior. Those in power felt secure looking down on her. The colonial thinkers of the era viewed her as a pleasant diversion at best, a foolish girl at worst. And as the 1930s darkened with the clouds of fascism, even more dangerous men began to take notice of her, only to ridicule and revile her. In Vienna, hateful posters called her a black devil before she even arrived. Nazi thugs in Germany even attacked her on stage during one 1929 Berlin show. Brown-shirt extremists set off an ammonia stink bomb in the theater and chased her out, snarling that she should go back to Africa. To Adolf Hitler's followers, Josephine was the embodiment of everything they despised, a successful black woman celebrated in decadent Paris, married to a Jewish man, a living rebuke to their Aryan delusions. The Reich's propaganda machine labeled her jazz performances as degenerate, unworthy of German soil. They laughed at the very idea that this colored dancer could ever threaten their grand vision. She was a joke to them, a footnote, a non-entity to be mocked and, if necessary, erased. What none of them understood, what Hitler himself could not grasp, was that Josephine Baker possessed a strength and cunning that did not announce itself on the surface. Behind the glamorous grin and sultry eyes was a fiercely intelligent woman with a heart of iron. She had survived poverty, racism, and abuse long before any European elite ever heard her name. She knew real hardship, the kind that forges a quiet resolve. And now, as the world spiraled toward war, she was about to deliver one of the most stunning indignities to the Nazi creed, not with bombs or guns, not with speeches or rallies, but with secrets hidden in plain sight. By the time the dust of World War II settled, Josephine Baker, the very same performer they had once dismissed as a clownish, exotic, would emerge as a decorated war hero. She would help humble an empire that had sneered at her existence. The laughable dancing girl would become a stealthy weapon, smuggling vital intelligence under the noses of the Gestapo, outwitting the FU-Hers henchmen at their own game. Her transformation from revue star to resistance spy is one of the great legends of the war, and it's completely true. This is the story of how a poor black girl from the slums of St. Louis became the woman who outfoxed the Nazis when no one was watching. But to understand how Josephine Baker turned ridicule into retribution, we must go back to the very beginning to the world that shaped her, and the forces that would forge her destiny. 1906, St. Louis, Missouri. The world that greets Freda Josephine McDonald is a world designed to keep her down. Born on June 3 of that year in the poverty-stricken black slums of East St. Louis, she comes into life with 3 strikes already against her. She's black, she's poor, and she's a girl. Her mother, Carrie McDonald, is just a teenager herself. Struggling to make ends meet as a washerwoman, her father is absent, rumored to be a vaudeville drummer who never stuck around. Home is a ramshackle room in a crumbling neighborhood of brothels and rooming houses without indoor plumbing. The walls are thin, the roof leaks. Baby Josephine goes to bed hungry, sometimes sheltering in cardboard boxes as a bed, lulled to sleep by the distant rumble of trains and the squeaking of rats. On the hungriest days, she would even scavenge for bits of food in garbage cans to survive. By age 8, she's working as a lev in made-for-white families, a little colored girl, expected to bow her head and obey. Once, when she put too much soap in the laundry by mistake, her white mistress punished her by scalding young Josephine's hands with boiling water. The burns taught her a cruel lesson in this world. Black children's pain meant nothing to those in charge. Outside the kitchen doors where she toiled, the entire society around Josephine enforced strict boundaries for people of her color. This was the era of Jim Crow America, when segregation was the law of the land and lynchings were a constant threat in the South. In St. Louis, racism was as normal as the sunrise. Black families lived in certain neighborhoods, took the worst jobs, received the poorest schooling. The message was clear: a black girl's life was to amount to the same as countless black girls before, maybe a life scrubbing floors or serving food, if she was lucky, dreaming beyond that was considered dangerous or foolish. And anyone who dared challenge the racial order could face terrible violence. Josephine saw that violence with her own eyes. In the summer of 1917, when she was only 11, a horrifying race riot erupted across the river in East St. Louis. White mobs, furious about black workers taking their jobs at a local factory, stormed through black neighborhoods with guns and torches. They burned black families out of their homes, shot innocent people in the streets, and left corpses in the gutters. Little Josephine stood on the west bank of the Mississippi and watched the night sky glow orange with the flames of black homes set ablaze. She heard the distant screams of men, women, and children fleeing for their lives, carrying nothing but the clothes on their backs. We children stood huddled together in bewilderment. She later remembered, frightened to death by the screams of people running across the bridge to escape the carnage. That night seared itself into Josephine's memory. The message was unmistakable in America. A black life could be erased in an instant, and the wider world might not blink an eye. Yet amid this terror and hardship, Josephine discovered something that gave her strength, something that would shape the rest of her life. She discovered performance. Even as a child, dancing and music were her escape. She'd dance on street corners downtown, a wiry little girl in a threadbare dress and mismatched shoes, stamping her feet and twirling for any coins passers-by might throw. Sometimes she performed with other local kids, putting on pretend shows behind tenement buildings to make the younger children laugh. Her antics could momentarily lift the weight of worry from her neighbors' shoulders. When Josephine danced, she didn't feel poor or unwanted or scared, she felt free. By her early teens, that freedom became Josephine's lifeline. She ran away from home multiple times, escaping a brief and unhappy child marriage at age 13 to a local boy named Willie Wells. She lived hand to mouth on the road, joining up with traveling vaudeville troupes as a dresser and chorus girl. Vaudeville life was rough, constant touring, low pay, and if you were black, constant discrimination, but it offered a chance to be on stage, to shine. Josephine grabbed it with both hands. Petite, clever, and determined, she learned every dance step she could and watched the older performers intently, absorbing their tricks. By 1921, at just 15, she made it to New York City during the blooming Harlem Renaissance, a cultural explosion of black art, music, and style. In Harlem's clubs and theaters, Josephine was dazzled by legends like Ethel Waters and Florence Mills, and she soaked up the era's creative energy. After several auditions, she secured a spot in the chorus line of an all-black Broadway revue, Shuffle Along. On that Broadway stage, Josephine Baker was the youngest and most inexperienced dancer, and the producers made sure she knew it. They shoved her to the tail end of the chorus line, thinking the audience wouldn't pay much attention to the skinny teenage girl on the edge. At her audition, she had won her spot by intentionally crossing her eyes and dancing with comic awkwardness until the directors couldn't stop laughing, a genius bit of improvisation that masked her true skill. But Josephine refused to be invisible. Night after night, performing the show's jazzy numbers, she deliberately added her own comic flair to stand out. She would roll her eyes wildly or pretend to stumble in time with the music, sending titters through the crowd. Her fellow dancers were astonished. She was going off script. But the audience loved it. Their eyes were drawn to the end of the line, to the girl who dared to be different. Josephine had figured out an important secret. If they were going to laugh at her, she'd make sure she controlled the laughter. By turning herself into a clever clown on stage, she wasn't the butt of the joke, she was in on the joke, bending it to her advantage. It was a risky move, but it made her a minor sensation. Soon the chorus line dancer that everyone had underestimated became a comic highlight of the show. Shuffle Along success gave Josephine a ticket into the performing big leagues. She went on tour with the show and, once she came of age, joined another popular all-black revue, the Chocolate Dandies, in 1924. By age 18, she had made a name for herself as a dynamic performer who could dance, act, and make audiences laugh all at once. But even as her star rose, the limitations for a black entertainer in America were painfully clear. She could be popular on stage, yes, but she was still barred from many hotels, restaurants, and clubs because of segregation. White critics often belittled black shows as low-brow entertainment. The larger American society still saw black performers as curiosities, never as true artists. Josephine hungered for a place where she could truly be free not just to perform, but to exist without the constant sting of bigotry. That place, she would soon find, was Paris. In 1925, an opportunity came that would change Josephine's life forever. An enterprising producer invited her to join a new show in Paris called La Revue Negre, an all-black musical extravaganza intended to introduce jazz and African-American dance to French audiences. Josephine was just 19 and had never left the United States, but she leapt at the chance. Anything had to be better than the prejudice she had endured in her homeland. She packed her few belongings, boarded an ocean liner with the troupe, and sailed to France, leaving behind the country of her birth with no regrets. "I just couldn't stand America," she would say later. "So I took a chance on Paris." When the curtains opened on Josephine's first performance in Paris, she stepped into a world unlike any she'd known. The show's organizers had dressed her in a costume that even she found shocking at first. Little more than a skirt of rubber flamingo feathers that barely covered her, and a string of beads, nothing else. It was bold, it was scandalous, and it was meant to shock. Josephine hesitated for a heartbeat backstage, but then the music, a wild jazz rhythm, began, and she remembered why she was there. She took a deep breath and launched into what they called the dance sauvage, the savage dance, flinging her limbs and undulating to the drums with deliberate abandon. The Parisian audience had never seen anything like it. Here was this young black woman from America, moving with a raw, unbridled energy that to their European eyes seemed both utterly exotic and exhilarating. She danced as if possessed by some primal spirit, eyes wide and mischievous, legs flying in perfect time, a joyous grin on her face. By the end of her act, the crowd sat stunned for a split second and then erupted in applause, cheers, even delighted laughter. It was pandemonium. Josephine Baker had just taken Paris by storm. Almost overnight, she became the toast of the town. The French in the 1920s were fascinated by African and African-American culture, or at least their romanticized notion of it. Paris was a city where art and novelty were adored, and Josephine's presence hit like a lightning bolt. Here was the personification of le jazz hot, the jazz craze, a beautiful, daring black dancer who seemed to channel something elemental on stage. They gave her admiring nicknames: La Baccaillard, the Black Pearl, the Bronze Venus, and the Friole Goddess. In upscale Parisian music halls, people eagerly paid to watch her perform in ever more sensational outfits, most famously, a skirt made of bananas. Yes, real bananas strung around her waist like an absurd tutu of fruit. In that now legendary routine at the Folies Bergerie in 1926, Josephine danced the Charleston in the banana skirt with comedic sensuality, at one point intentionally crossing her eyes and chasing the orchestra conductor, sending the audience into peals of laughter and applause. She was playing exactly the role they expected, the wild, jungle girl, untamed and joyous, and in doing so, she owned the Paris nightlife scene. Yet behind some of the acclaim lay a layer of patronizing exoticism. France in the 1920s was proud of its vast colonial empire, and many Parisians were fascinated by what they saw as primitive cultures. The city's 1931 colonial exposition even displayed villages of colonized peoples as living exhibits, a human zoo of sorts. To a portion of her audience, Josephine was another alluring curiosity from abroad. They loved her, but in a way that still treated her as other. She was well aware of this. "Is that what they think I am, a savage?" she once joked to a friend. On stage, she played into those expectations with sly humor, but off stage, She carried herself with refinement and refused to be anyone's pet or pawn. Her shows were bold and unapologetic, often with Josephine clad in nothing but that skirt and some costume jewelry, making silly faces one minute and striking seductive poses the next. Paris had simply never seen a star quite like her. By her early 20s, this girl who once scavenged for food in St. Louis was said to be the highest paid entertainer in all of Europe. She starred in movies, recorded hit songs, and purchased a lavish home in the French countryside. She even bought pet animals to enhance her mystique, including a pet cheetah named Chiquita that would accompany her on stage with a diamond collar. Chiquita frequently escaped into the orchestra pit, terrorizing the musicians and adding a whole new element of excitement to the show. Josephine would laugh and chase after the big cat as the audience roared. It was all part of the spectacle, part of the allure of Josephine Baker. The intellectual and artistic elites of the day were equally entranced by her. Ernest Hemingway himself called her the most sensational woman anyone ever saw, and he spent hours talking with her in Parisian cafes, reveling in her wit. The artist Pablo Picasso sketched her alluring beauty, and French playwright Jean Cocteau befriended her and wove her charismatic presence into his writings. She became a muse and a trendsetter. Josephine even marketed her own line of hair pomade called Baker Fix, and endorsed everything from shoes to cosmetics. By the end of the 1920s, she was more than an entertainer, she was a cultural phenomenon. But as Josephine basked in her Parisian fame, storm clouds were gathering. In Germany, Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party rose to power in 1933, preaching a doctrine of racial hatred that targeted Jews, blacks, and other minorities. By the late 1930s, Josephine Baker came to represent nearly everything the Nazis hated. Not only was she a successful black woman thriving in Europe, but in 1937 she had married a Jewish French industrialist, Jean Lion becoming a French citizen. To make matters worse, in Nazi eyes, she was also openly bisexual and moved in avant-garde circles of artists and free thinkers. She was a symbol of the cosmopolitan, multicultural, liberated world that fascism wanted to destroy. When Josephine toured Central Europe in the late 1920s, she hadn't known who Hitler was, but by the late 1930s, his followers certainly knew who she was. In Nazi propaganda, jazz music and Negro dances were decried as part of the degenerate, culture-corroding Aryan civilization. If war came, Josephine understood that she would be in danger. And in September 1939, that war did come. Nazi Germany ignited World War II by invading Poland. France and Britain declared war in response. Suddenly, the unthinkable was real. The Nazis, who openly despised Josephine's very existence, were now the enemies of her adopted country. Josephine was in Paris when war broke out, still performing nightly at the swanky Café de Paris and broadcasting cheery songs on Radio Paris to calm the public. But instead of panicking or fleeing back to Americas, as some Americans in Paris did, she reacted with steely determination. This country and city that had given her the freedom she never found in America were now under threat, and Josephine would not abandon them. France made me what I am, she told Captain Jacques Apty, the head of French counterintelligence in Paris. The Parisians gave me their hearts, and I am ready to give them my life. At first, Josephine did what she knew best. She used her celebrity to boost morale. In the autumn of 1939, as French troops mobilized along the front, she performed for soldiers in training camps and on radio broadcasts, singing lively tunes to keep spirits up. But she hungered to contribute more directly to the fight against fascism. An opportunity to do so came in the most unlikely form. Early in the war, Captain Jacques Apty, head of French military counterintelligence, approached Josephine with a proposition that stunned her. Would she serve her adopted country as a spy? On the surface, it sounded almost absurd. Josephine Baker, world-famous entertainer working in espionage. Typically, spies were supposed to be inconspicuous nobodies, not glittering celebrities. Apty himself admitted it was unconventional. How could Josephine travel without being noticed? But that, he explained, was exactly the point. Fame would be her camouflage. Who would ever suspect the great Josephine Baker of doing something as mundane as espionage? Her celebrity gave her access to the corridors of power. She could attend embassy parties, consulate dinners, high society galas, the very places where military secrets might spill from loose tongues over cocktails. People in those circles talked freely around her because they viewed her as harmless, an ornament, just an entertainer. Josephine understood immediately. She had spent years in fancy salons and clubs hearing the chat of the powerful. Now she could put that to use. And in her heart burned both love for France and a deep hatred of racism. An overriding consideration was my violent hatred of discrimination in any form. She later said of her decision, fighting the Nazis, the ultimate racists, was deeply personal for her. She agreed without hesitation. Josephine Baker became Agent W918, an honorable correspondent of the French Deux Bureau of Military Intelligence. Immediately, Josephine proved to be an ingenious spy. By day, she performed as usual, maintaining her public image. By night, she worked with Captain Apty, honing plans to gather intelligence on the Axis. She leveraged her social calendar to snoop on the enemy. Despite the war, Paris's diplomatic receptions continued and Axis representatives from neutral nations still circulated. Josephine would attend soirée as at the Italian embassy, dazzling the crowd in an elegant gown and diamonds, sipping champagne and exchanging pleasantries with high-ranking Italian fascist officials. All the while, she listened keenly for useful tidbits. Were the Italians planning to join Hitler's war soon? What were Japanese diplomats saying about the conflict? She made mental notes of every scrap of information. Nobody thought twice about chatting openly around her. To them, she was Josephine, the light-hearted entertainer, interested only in music and gossip. They had no idea that after politely excusing herself to the powder room, Josephine would lock the stall door and scribble notes in pencil on her palms and forearms, recording what she overheard. At one party, Apty later recounted, she even wrote a few key names on the underside of her dinner plate when she ran out of space on her skin. She memorized entire conversations with her keen mind, then reported everything to Captain Apty in late night debriefings. "Oh, nobody would think I'm a spy." She laughed when Apty cautioned her about the danger. Indeed, her boldness was remarkable. Josephine's espionage work did not stop at cocktail chatter. She had even earned a civilian pilot's license. And during the early months of the war, the so-called phony war, she took to the skies on training missions, acting as an auxiliary pilot to help spot German forces from the air. She would put on a flight suit and climb into military aircraft, scouting the locations of German airfields and troops, then landing to pass the notes to Apty. She truly believed she could operate without raising suspicion, and she was largely right. Her café society fame enabled her to rub shoulders with those who know from many countries. She socialized with Japanese diplomats, Italian officers, even Vichy French officials, charming them as she had always done and trying to remember every interesting item to transmit. She had one great advantage. No one considered that Josephine Baker could be an agent. In May 1940, the war that had been static suddenly exploded into full fury. The German Wehrmacht launched a massive invasion to the west, smashing through the Low Countries and then into France itself. Within weeks, Nazi tanks were charging toward Paris. The city panicked. Civilians by the millions fled south. The roads were jammed with an endless flood of refugees. Josephine Baker refused to panic. As German panzers closed in, Captain Apty gave Josephine a new mission. She was too valuable to be caught. She needed to evacuate Paris and continue her work from elsewhere. Josephine was reluctant to leave her beloved city, but she understood. She packed as much as she could into her car, refusing to travel light even in wartime. She loaded up her gold leaf piano and even a bed that had once belonged to Marie Antoinette into a convoy of vans and prepared to head south. But she wasn't evacuating empty-handed. Over the frantic weeks of April-May 1940, Josephine and Apty had gathered documents that needed to reach the Allies. Some were photographs of German military installations, others were written reports of Nazi troop concentrations. Josephine stashed these secrets in ingenious ways. She pinned some of the smaller notes inside her brassiere and underwear, and she carried sheets of music with invisible ink writing between the musical staffs. If she were searched, it would look like nothing more than her sheet music for performances. As Josephine later noted, who would dare search Josephine Baker to the skin? When they asked me for papers, They generally meant autographs. When the Germans broke through, Paris was declared an open city. The French government fled to the south. In early June 1940, Josephine left Paris too, driving 300 miles southwest to her country estate, Château des Malandes, in the Dordogne region, the unoccupied, free zone of France. By then, France was collapsing. Within weeks, the German onslaught reached the gates of Paris. The French army was overrun. Millions of civilians crowded the roads in a desperate exodus. Josephine joined the tide of humanity heading toward the Loire Valley. She witnessed heartbreaking scenes. Families trudging on foot with children in their arms, drawn carts piled high with whatever belongings they could salvage, automobiles crammed with whole families inching south while Stuka dive bombers roared overhead. The highways were choked with cars, wagons, bicycles, and people on foot. At one point, a German plane strafed a column of refugees not far ahead, sending people screaming into ditches. It was chaos and terror, an ordeal unlike any she had experienced. But Josephine steeled herself and kept driving, determined to bring her precious cargo of intelligence to safety. On June 22, 1940, France officially fell to the Nazis. The northern half of the country, including Paris, was occupied. The south became the ostensibly independent but collaborationist Vichy French state. Josephine's Château des Malandes lay in Vichy territory, for the moment, relatively safer than Paris. There, Josephine threw herself into resistance work with even greater fervor. The Château became a virtual resistance headquarters. She sheltered refugees, including Jews, fleeing Nazi persecution, offering them space in her home, obtaining visas or forged papers for them when she could. Her estate also provided a center for resistance activities. She allowed the installation of a secret radio transmitter in the cellar to communicate with London, and weapons were smuggled in and hidden on the grounds. All the while, she maintained a facade of normalcy. Vichy officials, Esser, and even some German officers were fans of Josephine and viewed her as a political, so they didn't immediately suspect her. She cultivated that image, hosting lavish dinners for local Vichy bureaucrats, smiling and entertaining them, all to deflect scrutiny from the covert operations quietly running under their noses. However, Josephine's clandestine activities were not entirely unnoticed. By late 1940, whispers reached the German occupiers that something odd might be happening at Château des Malandes. One day, a German military patrol car arrived unannounced at her gates. Josephine's staff rushed to warn Hurd armed German officers were here to search the premises. If they found the radio transmitter or the resistance members hiding in the attics and wine cellar, it would mean arrest and almost certainly execution for treason. Josephine did not flinch. She quickly instructed the resistance men on site to hide in a secret compartment in the barn. Sensitive documents were hastily burned or tucked away. Then, elegant and unbothered, Josephine greeted the German officers at the door herself. With a warm smile, speaking German politely, she welcomed them inside. The Gestapo agents were disarmed by her graciousness. For the next hour, Josephine led the Nazis on a tour of her Château. They opened drawers, peered under beds, tapped on walls, searching for anything suspicious. They found nothing. Josephine had been too clever, and what they did find, Ellier's boxes of fan mail, stage costumes, music scores only reinforced the impression that she was exactly what she appeared, a glamorous entertainer living in the countryside. During the search, Josephine kept the Germans entertained. She joked with the lead officer about how bored she was in this rural exile. She offered the soldiers refreshments, at one point producing a tray of pastries and pouring coffee for the Gestapo chief in her own parlor. Her ease and charm were disarming in the literal sense. The men grew convinced that any rumors of resistance activity at the Château were baseless. After all, wasn't Josephine Baker herself openly chatting with them? After an exhaustive search, the Gestapo team found no evidence. They apologized for the intrusion. Josephine, ever the gracious hostess, replied with a light laugh, "No trouble at all, messieurs. I wish I could entertain you better, perhaps next time. A proper dinner." The flattered officers tipped their caps and left. Only once their car disappeared down the drive did Josephine allow herself to sag against the doorway, relief flooding through her. That had been too close. She knew the Gestapo could return without warning. She knew if the Nazis ever did catch her, they would show no mercy. The very next day, she sent word through resistance channels to London Josephine Baker needed to get out of France. Indeed, shortly afterward, General Charles de Gaulle's Free French Organization in London ordered Captain Abdi and Josephine to leave France and make their way to Britain. In November 1940, Josephine and Abdi made their daring escape. The official cover story was that Josephine Baker was embarking on a performance tour of neutral Portugal and the Americas, a perfect excuse to leave Vichy France. Under this guise, they traveled to Spain, which, though ruled by the fascist Franco, remained neutral in the war and provided a route to Portugal. The journey was tense. At the Spanish border, German SS officers were monitoring checkpoints as Spain subtly cooperated with the Nazis. If Josephine were caught with secret documents, it could be the end. As their train neared the border, Josephine prepared her disguise: a luxurious fur coat, a fashionable hat, an unconcerned smile. All eyes naturally fell on the famous star traveling in their midst. When uniformed German inspectors entered her train car, Josephine turned on her charm to full wattage. A stern Gestapo man asked for her identification. She handed over her passport with a playful flutter of eyelashes. The officer's cold demeanor melted into surprise, perhaps even a bit of struck giddiness on seeing the name Josephine Baker. What was this celebrity doing here? Josephine explained with an easy laugh that she was going to Portugal for a concert tour. The officer barely glanced at her luggage. He was too busy stammering requests for autographs. Josephine indulged him, signing her name with a flourish on scraps of paper for his wife, his daughter, himself. Not once did he think to search the stacks of musical score sheets in her valise sheets that, with a certain regent, would reveal invisible ink writings detailing German troop dispositions. Nor did he ask to pat down the singer's body, where small notes with military secrets were literally pinned inside her undergarments. Within minutes, the border check was done. The German officers wished her a pleasant trip and even carried her bags back onto the train for her. Josephine was through. My notes would have been highly compromising had they been discovered, she later admitted, but who would dare search Josephine Baker to the skin? When they asked me for papers, they generally meant autographs. Josephine arrived in Lisbon, Portugal, in late 1940 with a tremendous sense of relief. Lisbon at that time teemed with spies of every stripe. It was a city of whispered secrets and shadowy dealings. A perfect crossroads for an agent in transit. Josephine delivered the precious intelligence documents she carried to British contacts there. The information she smuggled out was deemed highly valuable, filling in gaps in Allied knowledge of German defenses and plans. But Josephine was far from done. Under the guise of resting her health, she lingered in Portugal and nearby Spain, continuing to gather details about Axis troop movements at embassy parties in both neutral countries. She would enchant wealthy Spaniards and Portuguese, some of whom were Nazi sympathizers at soirees, then sneak off to a powder room to jot notes on paper in safety, pin them to the inside of her bra. Who would dare search Josephine Baker? Indeed, no one did. With each train or plane journey, she ferried these notes to the British Embassy in Lisbon, which forwarded them to London. Her bold efforts paid off. The British later noted how Josephine's reports provided crucial insights into Axis activities in Western Europe. In January 1941, Josephine received a new assignment from de Gaulle's Free French leadership. She was to go to North Africa to continue her work in the French colonies, which were still under Vichy control. Officially, she went to Morocco for health reasons. A bout of pneumonia had left her weak, or so it was said. In reality, she and Abdi were to set up a liaison and spy network in French North Africa. Josephine arrived in Casablanca with style. She brought along 28 pieces of luggage, crammed with costumes, personal items, and possibly a few transmitters, her entourage of servants, and even her pet monkeys and a Great Dane dog. The sight of Josephine Baker, the Josephine Baker, stepping onto the dock in Casablanca in 1941 was beyond surreal for the local French garrison. And, like everywhere she went, her conspicuousness proved to be her shield. The Vichy authorities in North Africa treated her as an honored guest, utterly unsuspecting of her secret mission. In Morocco and later Algiers, Josephine slipped into a comfortable routine of espionage. She performed for French colonial society, charming audiences of French expatriates and Moroccans with jazz concerts while simultaneously working with the local resistance network. She used her influence to obtain visas and passports for Jews fleeing Europe, saving many lives with her connections. She maintained close contact with the British and American intelligence agents who lurked in the cafes of Casablanca, not unlike the famous movie that would be made years later. In Marrakesh, she befriended the local Pasha I's governor, who admired her greatly during her illness. This Pasha of Marrakech even provided support and medical resources to ensure she was cared for. Ah, yes, the illness. In mid-1941, Josephine faced her gravest danger, not from bullets or bombs, but from her own body. Years of exhausting work and the damp conditions of old Moroccan fortresses triggered a serious decline in her health. She came down with another case of pneumonia that June, and then suffered a devastating miscarriage as she had hoped to have a child with her then husband Joe Bouillon. Complications set in an infection that turned into peritonitis, then deadly sepsis. Doctors had to perform an emergency hysterectomy to save her life, and Josephine hovered at death's door for days. She was hospitalized for 18 months in Casablanca. At one point, her fever climbed so high and her condition seemed so hopeless that an American newspaper, the Chicago Defender, mistakenly printed her obituary. The great poet Langston Hughes penned a mournful tribute, calling her as much a victim of Hitler as the soldiers who fall today. When Josephine came to and heard that some believed her dead, she mustered a faint smile and quipped, "There has been a slight error. I'm much too busy to die." Busy she was even as she lay in bed. She continued working. Her hospital room became an unlikely resistance salon. American diplomats, free French couriers, and local Moroccan resistance visited her often, ostensibly to bring flowers and, well, wishes. In truth, they used these visits to hold meetings right at her bedside. Propped up on pillows, pale but indomitable, Josephine discussed plans and passed along whatever intelligence she could glean. By November 1942, Josephine was well enough to sit up on her balcony in Casablanca and witness an incredible sight. Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa. She watched as waves of American, British, and Free French troops poured into the port from the Atlantic. The city she had come to love was being liberated from Vichy rule. From her hospital balcony, Josephine saw American GIs, many of them black, marching in, and she wept tears of joy and pride. The balance of the war had shifted. The Allies now controlled North Africa, and Josephine, still technically convalescing, was eager to jump back into action. In 1943, once cleared by doctors, Josephine Baker donned a military uniform, once again, this time as a member of the Free French Women's Auxiliary Air Force. She organized and performed in USO-style shows for Allied soldiers across North Africa and the Middle East. Now, instead of silk and feathers, she often wore a khaki uniform and cap, yet she was as mesmerizing as ever. By day she traveled in jeeps across scorching deserts to reach remote camps. By night, she would set up an impromptu stage, sometimes nothing more than a circle of truck headlights, illuminating a patch of sand, and sing her heart out for troops who hadn't seen a woman, much less a world-class entertainer, in months. She sang her signature tune, J. Dick's Amorce. I have two loves, my country in Paris, her rich voice drifting over silent tank corps and infantry units assembled under the stars. Often, the only backdrop was the dim outline of palm trees and the distant boom of artillery at the front. It was magical and deeply moving. In one forward camp in Tunisia, she ended her set with a soft French lullaby. When she finished, there was a heavy silence, followed by an eruption of applause, so thunderous it echoed into the night. Hardened soldiers wiped tears from their eyes. Josephine stepped down from her stage, a couple of ammunition crates, and walked among them, shaking hands. She insisted on visiting field hospitals as well, singing at the bedsides of wounded Allied soldiers and joking with them to lift their spirits. She refused any special treatment for herself. She ate army rations, slept on the ground beside her vehicle to avoid the risk of landmines on unfamiliar roads, and even stood in line for water with everyone else. For these men havres, and they were mostly men, seeing Josephine Baker share their hardships was indescribably inspiring. Finally, in the summer of 1944, the war brought Josephine home. The Allies landed in Normandy in June. Paris rose up in rebellion in August. On August 25, 1944, Paris was officially liberated. Josephine, who had been performing for troops in Italy, raced back to her adopted city as soon as transport allowed. In October 1944, Josephine Baker returned to Paris in triumph, not in a glittering gown this time, but in a free French uniform with captain's stripes. Riding in the back of an open military jeep, she joined General de Gaulle's victory parade down the Champs-Élysées. Crowds thronged the Grand Boulevard, tossing flowers and cheering wildly. They saw Josephine and roared with delight. Here was their beloved star and their beloved resistante, united in one woman, dressed in her crisp blue Air Force jacket with gold epaulettes, her chest shining with medals. Josephine waved and blew kisses. People shouted her name, "Vive Josephine!" That evening, Parisian dignitaries, who 2 decades earlier might have sniffed at the jazzy-colored girl, hosted a reception in her honor. Josephine stood on a balcony at the H. Hotel de Ville and led a chorus of the Marseillaise. For a moment, her powerful voice soared a cappella above the cheering throng of Parisians. Even General de Gaulle was seen dabbing his eyes. After the war, France wasted no time in acknowledging Josephine's extraordinary contributions. She was loaded with honors. General de Gaulle himself awarded her the Croix de Guerre for bravery, as well as the Médaille de l'Art Assistance. She was made a Chevalier of the Légion d'honneur. The highest order of merit in France, de Gaulle pinned that medal on her uniform in 1961. She would proudly wear her war decorations, the gleaming 5-pointed star of the Légion d'honneur at her throat, the ribbon of the Croix de Guerre, and the rosette of the Resistance Medal on her chest at public events in years to come. At that 1961 ceremony, Josephine donned her uniform once again and, eyes brimming with tears, told the audience, "I am proud to be French because this is the only place in the world where I can realize my dream." In 1949, bolstered by the recognition of her heroism, Josephine returned to the Paris stage in triumph. She headlined a new revue at the Folies Bergère, and the engagement was a rousing success. Paris once more fell in love with her. Critics noted a new depth in her performances. Baker the entertainer had acquired a gravity and confidence from Baker the war hero. Unafraid to take on more serious music, she sang torch songs and operatic arias alongside her classic jazz numbers. She was again one of the city's pre-eminent stars, proving that her wartime courage had only heightened her star power. Having given so much for France, Josephine might have rested on her laurels. But that was not in her nature. She had one more battle to fight, this time in the country of her birth. By the 1950s and 60s, the civil rights movement was in full swing in the United States. Josephine watched from France as Black Americans stood up against segregation and racism, and she yearned to help. In 1951, she finally returned to America for the first time since the 1930s. She was invited for a nightclub tour, something she had always wanted, to at last perform in her native land on her own terms. Upon arriving, Josephine immediately made headlines by refusing to perform for segregated audiences. In Miami, she flatly refused to go on stage until the club allowed black and white patrons to sit together. The club gave in, and Josephine's show played to an integrated audience, reportedly the first in that venue's history. The NAACP honored her for this stand, naming her Woman of the Year in 1951 and throwing a parade for her in Harlem. Josephine, it seemed, was poised to conquer America at last, not just as a performer, but as an activist. But America in the 1950s was a tinderbox of racial tension and Red Scare paranoia. In October 1951, Josephine went to Manhattan's famous Sex and Segregated Stork Club as a guest and was insultingly refused service for over an hour. Outrage, she stormed out and publicly accused the club of racism, and also criticized the influential gossip columnist Walter Winchell, who had been present and stayed silent during her mistreatment. Winchell, once an ally, turned on her viciously. He used his media platform to smear Josephine, insinuating she had communist sympathies, a devastating accusation in the McCarthy era. The incident exploded into headlines. The NAACP organized picket lines outside the Stork Club protesting its racist policies. Baker, for her part, filed a defamation lawsuit against Winchell over his slanders. A city investigation into the club's conduct was launched, but in the end the authorities claimed they found insufficient evidence of discrimination. Nevertheless, Josephine's reputation had been unfairly tarnished. Many of her U.S. engagements were canceled, and as the Red Scare hysteria mounted, even the U.S. State Department took note. By late 1951, she had been labeled controversial, and in early 1952 her American work visa was revoked on spurious grounds. Josephine, devastated that her own country would treat her this way after all she had done, quietly left America again. By 1953, she was essentially forced out of the United States once more. A decade later, however, the tides turned. In 1963, as the civil rights movement reached its climax, Josephine Baker returned to the U.S. to lend her fame to the cause. On August 28, 1963, she stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial as the only woman speaker at the historic March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Dressed proudly in her Free French uniform, her war medals, the gleaming star of the Légion d'honneur and the ribbon of the Croix de Guerre pinned to her chest, Josephine addressed the crowd of thousands before Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke. "I have walked into the palaces of kings and queens," she declared, "but I could not walk into a hotel in America and get a cup of coffee." The crowd fell silent, absorbing the weight of that truth from a woman who had fought for liberty abroad only to face injustice at home. She spoke of her love for America, her faith that the time has come for equality, and her belief that someday her people's rights would be respected like those she enjoyed in France. The audience responded with a swelling roar of applause. Later that day, as she stood not far from Dr. King while he proclaimed, "I have a dream," Josephine, wearing her uniform and medals in the August sun, had tears in her eyes. She said afterward that August 28, 1963, was one of the proudest days of her life. In her own way, she had fought for civil rights just as she'd fought the Nazis fiercely, tirelessly, and without fear. Josephine's later years were devoted to her humanitarian dream of proving racial harmony to the world. She began adopting children of all ethnic backgrounds, babies from Asia, Africa, Europe, South America, eventually 12 children in total, whom she dubbed her Rainbow Tribe. She raised them in France at her beloved estate Les Melandes, even opening her home to the public as something of a leaving exhibit of brotherhood. Visitors could buy tickets to watch the children of different races play together in harmony on the Chez Two grounds. Josephine truly believed that if people saw with their own eyes that racial differences didn't matter to children, they would unlearn their hatred. Her idealism was boundless, but so were the expenses of maintaining a castle and such a large family. By the 1960s, Josephine was in serious financial trouble. In 1968, she could no longer afford to keep Les Melandes. Josephine was evicted from her own beloved home after failing to pay the mortgage. When officials arrived to remove her, she reportedly locked herself in her bedroom. Sobbing that she would not leave, she had to be coaxed and carried out as she watched her furniture and memories being taken away. The woman who had given so much was left with almost nothing. Grace Kelly, now Princess Grace of Monaco, heard of Josephine's plight and swiftly stepped in. She offered Josephine and her children a place to live in Monaco and personally helped organize benefit concerts to assist her financially. It was a lifeline that saved Josephine from destitution and allowed her to keep what remained of her Rainbow Tribe together. With Princess Grace's support, Josephine never lost her will to perform. In 1973, at age 67, she returned to New York City for a one-night show at Carnegie Hall. Nervous about how America would receive her after so long, she stepped onto the Carnegie stage to a standing ovation. The audience, black and white, cheered and applauded before she even sang a note. Josephine was overcome with emotion. After years of feeling spurned, this moment was pure vindication. She wept openly onstage as the applause washed over her. It was a stark contrast to the chilly reception she'd gotten in 1936 and 1951. America, it seemed, had finally caught up to Josephine Baker. In April 1975, Josephine Baker embarked on one of the most remarkable final acts in show business history. It was the 50th anniversary of her Paris debut, and at 68 years old, she agreed to star in a grand retrospective revue in Paris. Many wondered if she could still command the stage. Opening night put all doubts to rest. Josephine, slim, energetic, radiant, performed to a packed house, that included celebrities and dignitaries from around the world. Princess Grace and Prince Rainier sat in the front row, as did Sophia Loren and Mick Jagger. She danced in elegantly modest costumes this time, and sang her signature numbers, accompanied by a troupe of young dancers. The reviews next morning were ecstatic. Josephine Baker, at her golden jubilee, was better than ever. The demand for tickets was so high that the show's run was extended. 4 days into the engagement, on April 12, 1975, Josephine basked in a flood of rave reviews. That very night, after an exhilarating performance, she went home to her apartment in Paris. The next morning, Josephine Baker was found peacefully in her bed. She had died in her sleep from a cerebral hemorrhage. It was as if her big heart, having accomplished everything it set out to do, finally decided it was time to rest. On her bedside table lay newspapers, open to columns praising her triumphant comeback. Josephine had exited the stage on the highest note possible. France mourned as never before for an entertainer. Josephine Baker was given a state funeral with full military honors, something almost unheard of for a woman and unprecedented for a black woman. On April 15, 1975, more than 20,000 people lined the streets of Paris as a military procession carried her flag-draped coffin from Les Invalides. A contingent of uniformed Free French veterans marched alongside, and the French Air Force band played La Marseillaise as the cortege made its way. At the Church of the Madeleine, where the funeral service was held, it is said that some mourners softly hummed J. Dick's Amours, Josephine's old song about her two loves, her country and Paris, bringing many to tears. After the service, her body was flown to Monaco-Cyprus, fulfilling a wish she had expressed to Princess Grace, and she was laid to rest in Monaco's cemetery, her final home provided, fittingly, by the princess who had stood by her. France, however, was not done honoring Josephine Baker. Her legacy only grew. In the decades since her passing, she has inspired countless books, documentaries, and even a celebrated HBO biopic. Generations of performers, from Diana Ross to Beyoncé, have cited her as an inspiration in artistry and courage. Streets and plazas in France have been named after her. And then, in 2021, came a tribute that even Josephine might never have imagined. She was inducted into the Panthéon in Paris. This monumental mausoleum is reserved for France's greatest national heroes, Voltaire, Victor Hugo, Marie Curie, and the like. On November 30, 2021, Josephine Baker became the first black woman and only the 6th woman of any race ever to be so honored in the Panthéon's history. In a solemn ceremony, a symbolic coffin containing soils from her birthplace, St. Louis, from Paris, from Les Milandes in the south of France, and from Monaco was carried by French Air and Space Force pallbearers into the Panthéon's hallowed crypt. As the Republican Guard Band played the French national anthem beneath the Panthéon's dome, some in attendance quietly sang along to J. Dick's Amours, the song that had once captivated Paris in gentle homage to Josephine's two loves, her country and Paris. The President of France, Emmanuel Macron, delivered a eulogy praising Baker as a war hero, fighter, dancer, singer, a black woman who defended mankind, but first of all, a French woman, a combattante de la liberté, a fighter for freedom. In that moment, the little girl from Staines, Louis, who once had to dance for coins on street corners, entered France's Valhalla of heroes. Josephine Baker's life is a testament to resilience, courage, and the audacity to dream. It has inspired books, films, and songs in the decades since her passing, ensuring that each new generation learns how a young black woman conquered the odds and stood for liberty. Her journey invites us to reflect on all the unrecognized potential in those we underestimate. How many? No bodies, have within them the spirit of a hero, just waiting for the moment to reveal itself. Josephine's journey from ridicule to respect remains a beacon. She showed that dignity can prevail over prejudice, that valor and love of freedom can bloom in the most unexpected gardens, even in the soul of a woman once dismissed as a dancing, wild woman. She wielded the very attributes people thought made her inferior, her blackness, her femininity, her glamour as weapons to fight for freedom and human dignity. She was both a sensual siren and a selfless soldier, a woman who packed neither pistol nor rifle, but carried a charm more disarming than either. She was, in effect, a revolutionary in a sequined gown. She was a warrior for liberty wrapped in the disguise of a performer. The world may have been slow to realize it, but by the time it did, Josephine had already changed that world for the better. Today, when you walk through the Panthéon in Paris, you will find Josephine Baker's name engraved in the company of generals, scientists, and statesmen. A poor, skinny black girl from Missouri lies in the crypt among the nation's greatest figures. Those who once laughed at her have fallen silent, their laughter replaced by reverence. Josephine Baker danced through life, and in doing so, she danced right into the pages of history forever. 5 Jose, fine!